Welcome to another PNW Weather 101 episode. And for the summer months, the heat risk becomes one of the biggest indices that the Portland National Weather Service likes to use. So, what is it? How does it factor into which type of warnings get issued, whether that's just the heat advisory or the extreme heat warning? Let's find out. First, the overview of it. It is technically still an experimental tool despite it being well used now in the local meteorological community and improves on the old heat index system because the old heat index system just took into account the current temperature or forecasted temperature and humidity and just took the peak of that versus the heat index takes a look at it from a overall perspective considering overnight temperatures, humidity, and more. So what goes into the heat risk? How unusually above normal are the temperatures? Like I mentioned, it also takes into account humidity levels. It also takes into account the time of the year the temperatures are occurring. So, for example, if it is happening earlier in the year, say May or June, when one, your body's not as used to it, or two, when the sun angles are more extreme, you're going to feel more heat related impacts than you would if it was in the latter portion of the season or the core in the case of the average temperatures. So it also takes into account beyond that the duration of unusual heat, which also takes into account overnight lows. So if you have just a single day where it's 105 degrees, but the low temperature is 60, you're not going to get as high of an extreme or as high of a rating as you would even if it was like 100 degrees for a high, but you got it for 3 days in a row and the low temperatures were 65 degrees because you're not really getting that relief. It'll also take into account with collaboration from the CDC if those temperatures were at levels that pose an elevated risk for heat complications. This also takes into account historical emergency room visits compared to similar setups. So once those emergency room visits start to rise in a similar setup, then that heat risk index is also going to rise as well. It is a 5 category system ranging from 0 to 4. A 0 out of 4 means there's little or no risk from expected heat. A 1 out of 4 primarily affects those who are extremely sensitive to the heat and without cooling or proper hydration. 2 out of 4 affects those who are just regularly sensitive to the heat, especially if you don't have cooling or hydration. Emergency room visits start to rise at this point, though the medical system doesn't reach critical levels until it starts getting into the major category and especially the extreme. The major category, almost everyone will see effects if you don't have proper cooling or hydration. And the extreme is rare or long duration extreme heat with little, if any, overnight relief. And it pretty much affects everyone at this point because at that point, your AC unit isn't even going to work properly since it's only designed to cool your house down about 20 to 25 degrees from the temperatures outside. So this would be reserved for something like what we experienced in June 2021, what I call the mother of all heat waves, when it was 115 to 117 in the northern Willamette Valley. And this gets translated into our heat advisories and extreme heat warnings as they're known now. This replaced the excessive heat warning that we used to call them. An extreme heat warning is when there's a heat risk of 2.66 or greater for generally a period longer than a day. A heat advisory is a heat risk of 2.4 to 2.65. The map on the Weather Prediction Center's website, which is a division of the National Weather Service, rounds it to the nearest whole number. So if you're viewing this from in the future compared to where I'm recording this on Saturday, June 13th, and we have a heat wave coming up and as a result, there's an extreme heat warning up for the greater Portland metro area, but the rest of the Willamette Valley, the Coast Range, and the Oregon coast is under a heat advisory. So let's take a look at what heat risks is going into triggering those warnings and how a forecast, despite similar high temperatures in Portland compared to the southern Willamette Valley, why Portland is under that extreme heat warning. I'll link this site in the description, so if you want to take a look at it in the future, you can. I will zoom into the Pacific Northwest since that is what I cover, but you can view anywhere in the country. We will start with, at the time of recording today, June 13th, and it shows most of the Willamette Valley, except for the high foothills, under a moderate heat risk. And if we move this to Sunday, we see that the major heat risk pops up, especially in the Portland area and the western portions of the Willamette Valley. This is where microclimates play into it, since the western portions of the Willamette Valley can experience a minor version in this case, east wind damming, but since hot air isn't as dense as cold air, it won't stick around for nearly as long as cold air would. But it still would stick around long enough to trigger a major heat risk. But the reason why the rest of the Willamette Valley isn't under an extreme heat warning comes into play on Monday, where that major heat risk category is just in the Portland metro area, excluding the West Hills and the Columbia River Gorge, which is what duration has to do with issuing these watches and warnings and going into the heat risk category. And as we go into Tuesday, because that is part of the extreme heat warning at time of recording, the greater Portland area is under a moderate heat risk at this time. It goes out to 7 days, which is the same as the National Weather Service's forecasts that they issue. Also, as a side note, this rounds it to the nearest whole number. So, like for instance, on Sunday, a lot of this might just be like 2.52, for example, but it's rounding up to a 3 just for map simplicity. In terms of how the forecast determines the heat risk slash which heat advisory or warning you're going to be under, I'm going to do my traditional 7-day forecast, one for Portland and one for the South Valley, but look at it from the perspective of the heat risk and what warning to issue as a result. So the red is all the daily record high temperatures, which is the most anomalous it's ever been for that day in terms of the high temperatures, which will happen on Sunday the 14th and Monday the 15th, and the low temperatures, which will occur in the mornings before and after those 2 days. So that is not the longest duration heat wave we've seen in the Portland area, but long enough and extreme enough, and the fact that it is still June, that triggered the major heat risk, and it is what's triggering the extreme heat warning. As a note, this is my personal forecast. This is not the National Weather Service's forecast, but their method would be the exact same as I am describing. For the southern Willamette Valley, the high temperatures are generally pretty similar within a couple of degrees. So the high temperatures using the old heat index system, it wouldn't make much of a difference, and the entire Willamette Valley would just be under a heat advisory using the old system. But using the new system, which takes into account these overnight low temperatures and the anomalous nature of it, shows that the Southern Valley, you're going to have more of a relief, since the low temperatures are only going to be hovering right around 60 degrees, comparing that to the Portland metro area, which will be hovering in the mid 60s. Also, there's not as much daily record high temperatures, which also goes into that heat risk factor. So as a result, the central and southern Willamette Valley is only under a heat advisory for this between Sunday morning and Tuesday evening, versus the Portland area is under an extreme heat warning for that same time period. Also, as a side note, because it takes into account overnight low temperatures, there's more. I expect that an urbanized area, especially one with its own zone like Portland, is going to be under an extreme heat warning more than rural areas. And that's because the urban heat island effect affects the low temperatures more than it does the high temperatures. In fact, sometimes, like in this particular setup, it's affecting it by about 5 degrees or so. And that does play into how much relief you get into that overnight time period, which again contributes to a higher heat risk for Portland on average during the summer months. So that is going to be it for this video. Thank you all for watching. Hopefully you learned something new from the heat risk if you haven't heard of it before. If you're watching this before this heat wave, please stay cool out there. And even if you're watching it afterwards, stay cool throughout the summer. And until next time, stay safe out there and take care.